There are 37 trillion cells in the human body, the microscopic building blocks of life, but none are more crucial to decision-making than neurons. But what are neurons? Neurons are tiny messengers that use chemicals to send signals throughout the brain and body. When we experience anything like light, or heat, or sound, that information travels through different pathways of neurons in order to get to the area of the brain where that type of message is processed.
There is one special pathway that we are going to talk about, and that is called the reward pathway. The reward pathway is activated for lots of different reasons. When we eat food, sleep, win a game, or experience any pleasant sensation, the neurons in our reward pathway are communicating. The experience causes a release of dopamine.
Dopamine is a type of chemical messenger called a neurotransmitter. When two neurons are close together, the one carrying the message may release dopamine in the gap in between, where it binds to special molecules called dopamine receptors. These receptors are made to perfectly catch or fit the dopamine released. If a neuron releases enough dopamine, the next neuron sends the message, similar to dominoes in a line falling down.
The signal then travels to the frontal cortex, a part of the brain in the front just behind your forehead. This part of the brain is responsible for a lot of our most complex thinking. It makes long-term plans, forms emotional responses, and thinks things through logically to make decisions. Here, the brain forms a positive association with whatever you just experienced. It basically says, that activity released dopamine. I liked that, and I want to do it again so I can get more dopamine. The neurons then take the signal to its final stop on the reward pathway, called the hippocampus. This part of the brain is responsible for forming long-term memories. When the signal reaches the hippocampus, it is stored permanently in the brain so that every time you encounter that same stimulus or sensation later, you are reminded of the dopamine rush associated with it.
Unfortunately, drugs also trigger the reward pathway. Most addictive drugs activate the reward pathway very intensely, so that a huge rush of dopamine goes throughout the brain. This creates a very positive association with the drug, which is stored in your hippocampus, so that anytime you see the drug, you crave that same rush of dopamine. This is how addictions are formed. When people smoke cigarettes, vape, or juul, a chemical called nicotine makes its way from the lungs to the bloodstream, where it is eventually carried to the brain. The nicotine molecule looks and acts very similar to another neurotransmitter that leads to the release of dopamine. But nicotine sends an even stronger signal for longer. With each inhalation off a cigarette or nicotine delivery device, more and more nicotine is brought to the brain, which in turn increases the amount of dopamine released. This rush of dopamine leads to a faster heart rate and a greater sense of happiness while also lowering anxiety, along with other symptoms that change the way you feel. In an attempt to get back to normal, the body will remove some of its dopamine receptors.
This means that with each time a person uses nicotine, they will need even more in order to feel the same rush as before. Just like it takes more nicotine to feel happy, other activities like seeing friends and eating chocolate might not lead to the same enjoyment. Because it becomes harder to feel as happy as before, habits like vaping and juuling can lead to a dependence and addiction. This is why it's important to know how addictive substances like nicotine will affect your brain before making the decision to use them.